Welcome back to the West London Witch. This episode contains adult and distressing themes and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised. 7:55 a.m., November 1885. As the bells of St. Peter Mancroft Church tolled throughout the ancient city of Norwich, England, inmate Robert Goodale was preparing for a short walk to the long drop. A team of prison officials gathered outside Goodale's cell at Norwich Castle Prison to accompany Goodale to the gallows, situated in the prison yard. At the end of the passage leading to the yard stood Goodale's executioner, Hangman James Barry, ready to cover Goodale's head with the customary white hood, affix the noose around his neck, and tie his legs together. Robert Goodale was a large man, weighing in at 210 pounds. He stood at 5 foot 11 inches and was later categorized as having a weak neck. Earlier in the week, Executioner Barry had assessed the prison gallows and had calculated the amount of rope needed for Goodale's execution. The gallows at Norwich Castle Prison had been in place for 3 years and were out of sight of the public, safely maintained within the prison walls. A trapdoor was placed above a 5 foot 11 inch deep brick pit, with the gallows looming above. As Goodale walked with his grim entourage, he repeated, "O God, receive my soul." As Goodale contemplated his fate, the governor of Norwich Castle, a Mr. Dent, was focused on how Goodale had ended up in this situation to begin with. Robert Goodale was a 45-year-old market gardener from Wisbech, Cambridgeshire. He had 2 sons and a wife, Bathsheba. The entire family worked together on a small farm, growing fruit, vegetables, and grains. It was back-breaking work. Long days, low pay, and as robust as Robert may have looked, it was reported that he was of ill health and may have struggled with the manual labor. The Goodale's marriage appeared a happy one, but neighbors and close friends knew the couple had their share of troubles. Neighbors later told police they had heard vicious fights between the pair. Bathsheba had on occasion ran to the neighbors' homes for refuge from a violent Robert. On the morning of September 15, 1885, when Bathsheba did not come to work with her husband, many eyebrows were raised. It didn't help that when asked where his wife was, Robert is reported to have replied that he had done the business and she would not be barking at him anymore. It wasn't long before Bathsheba's body was found, dead, at the bottom of a well. Soon after, Robert was arrested under the suspicion of murder. After a speedy trial and an even quicker deliberation of only 20 minutes, Robert Goodale was sentenced to death. The Friday before his execution, Goodale had asked to see Mr. Dent to confess to him that although he was there when his wife died, it wasn't murder. Goodale told Dent and the chief warden that in the middle of a bitter argument, Bathsheba proclaimed that she was done with the marriage. She was in love with another man, and she was leaving Robert. As she turned to leave, Robert, in a fit of rage and passion, grabbed the closest implement to hand, a billhook, a tool with a sharp, curved blade, and then proceeded to strike her 3 times in the back of the head. She was not dead, but rather severely wounded. She then proceeded to accidentally stumble and fall into the well. At this point, Robert had come to his senses and tried to rescue his wife. But due to the small opening of the well and his large stature, he could not get in to save her. It should be noted that blood and dirt were found on Goodale's clothes from the night in question, and the garments were wet. In addition, there was a ladder found near the well. In an abundance of caution, Mr. Dent had this new account sent to the Home Secretary for urgent review. However, much to Goodale's dismay, it did not stay his execution. As the final bell rang out across the town announcing 8 a.m., Executioner Barry released the trap door. With a flash, Robert Goodale dropped into the pit. However, only a moment later, after a sickening snap and a loud thud, the rope recoiled, and to the absolute horror of the onlookers, they saw an empty noose. The prison staff rushed to the pit and discovered a ghastly scene. There, at the bottom of the brick pit, was Robert Goodale's body. Laying next to it was his head. You see, Executioner Barry's calculations were clearly not very accurate. Although the execution was successful and instantaneous, it was obviously not the intended method. Robert Goodale was not only the only man in Norwich to be executed by beheading, but he was also the only decapitation by hanging ever in Great Britain. The Goodale mess, as the harrowing situation came to be known, was so grisly it was reported all over the world and was followed by a coroner's inquest. Executioner Barry was cleared of any wrongdoing, as the jury agreed that Goodale had in fact died by hanging in accordance to the judgment of the law. Yet, you would have not wanted to find yourself at the end of Executioner Barry's rope, for he was responsible for 2 more near decapitations, several agonizingly long deaths, and multiple failed attempts where the prisoner didn't die at all. On the first attempt, that is. However, Executioner Barry is not a great representation for the hangmen of England, as on a whole, they were an extremely successful and efficient bunch. Hangings in England were not abolished until 1969, with the final deaths by hanging occurring in 1964. Although it is clear that Robert Goodale did have a hand in his wife's death, hanging crimes could be as severe as murder or as mundane as forgery, theft, or chopping down trees. Untold scores of men, women, and children were executed by hangings in England. The scars of their tragic final moments can still be felt reverberating through the disused Hangman's Hills, prison yards, castle grounds, and city centers. Legend has it that Robert Goodale still roams the old grounds of Norwich Castle, searching for his head. Do you ever lie awake in bed at night and wonder, what is happening in the West London Witch Patreon? Are you plagued by the feeling that you're missing out? Do you want more content and a sneaky look into the inner workings of the West London Witch? Well, I just wanted to pop in and say that joining Patreon is super easy and affordable. I am very aware that we are deep in a cost of living crisis. So for as little as $1, €1, £1 a month, you can unlock the entire West London Witch Patreon and gain access to loads of additional content that you will never experience here on the main show. Patreon is a place where I share extra special interviews, behind-the-scenes stories and gossip, and answer your questions. And in return, you're also helping support the show as we work to share with you the best storytelling at the highest studio quality. So come join us at patreon.com/The West London Witch. Hello and welcome to episode 78 of The West London Witch, a podcast where we share stories about those moments where we find ourselves very much not alone. It is no secret that England has its share of grim and gory history. And as uncomfortable as it may be to confront it, it's also vital to look back to see where we as a society have come from and always challenge ourselves to grow and evolve going forward. Today we'll be diving into the history, haunts, and legacy of Bodmin Jail, a historic house of corrections situated on the edge of Bodmin Moor in the stunning county of Cornwall in southwest England. General Manager and historian Jess will be guiding us through this historic building, highlighting its dark past, chilling traditions, and the inmates who were never released. I'm Rebecca Strazina, and this is The West London Witch, Episode 78, Bodmin Jail.
If you'd found yourself breaking the law in the early 1700s and were going to spend time in jail, you would have spent that time in a place that wouldn't be recognised today, bottom of a castle, a house of correction, maybe a county bridewell. One big room and all the prisoners would have been put in it together, regardless of crime, regardless of gender. In fact, many prisoners never even made it to court. They would have died in those conditions. No food, no water, no medication, no sanitation. The state of our prisons in this country in the early 1700s was appalling. And in fact, that had been pretty much true for the century before that as well. We only have to look at the Pendle witch trials on Old Demdike to know just that, because she never made it to court. She died in just such an environment. The Georgians brought revolution to the century of the 1700s. They're a highly underrated period of history, woefully neglected, in my opinion. And prison reform is just one of those areas. And knocking around in the mid-1700s was a gentleman by the name of John Howard.
In 1774, John Howard was appointed the High Sheriff of Bedford. With his new title came new responsibilities, one of which was overseeing the infamous Bedford prison. However, upon his first inspection of the facility, he was filled with horror and disgust. The prison was in a horrendous state, unfit for man or beast. He was so appalled by the sight that he became inspired to create change in the prison system. He wrote a report directly to the government in England and Wales demanding reform.
But his report was quite long and wordy, so I'll praise it. Our prisons are dreadful, said Mr. Howard, and we need to do something about it. So he set about a campaign to do just that, and he designed a whole different style of prison. The reform prison was born. We are incredibly proud in Bodmin to have the first reform prison, a modern, revolutionary prison, utterly reforming the way that we dealt with inmates. Segregation for men and for women, 3 meals a day, running water, Education for the boys, obviously. Don't want to educate women yet in the 1700s, would be a bit dangerous. But education for boys, meaningful punishment, meaningful reward. Certainly you wouldn't have wanted to end up in there. It was no bed of roses. But what it aimed to do was to make you into a decent member of society, an upright model citizen. Now, the past is a complicated creature, and if we insert our own morals into it, it's very difficult to understand. So you've got to think Georgian. You've got to put yourself back in that time. And this was a time when there was no police force. And consequently, the way to deal with crimes and criminals was to lock them up and repeatedly put them through hard physical labour until they learnt their ways and adjusted their attitude.
Bodmin Jail housed men, women, and children. There was no age of criminal responsibility at this time, and the youngest inmate at Bodmin was just 6 years old. Heartbreakingly, their crime was vagrancy.
However, the conditions they would have faced would have been infinitely better than previous prisons, but still appalling by our standards. They were refused natural light unless they behaved themselves. They were put in isolation on dark landings until they proved they could behave inside. There was no talking. It was a silent prison, except for on a Sunday when you were allowed to go to chapel to sing. Although food was available, it was repeatedly said there wasn't enough of it. That first prison, built here in 1779, did okay for around 30 years and proved to be a model for other prisons across England and Wales.
The prison you see today is larger than the original building from 1790. It was extended after the Napoleonic Wars to combat overcrowding, and then supersized once more by the Victorians. Today, Bodmin Jail is a Grade 2 listed granite Victorian winged prison. It's big, imposing, designed to instill fear and intimidation.
The prison can be seen from all over Bodmin, exactly as it was meant to do. It's a deterrent. Don't break the law. That is where you'll end up. Now, I mentioned that the Georgians and the Victorians have a different style of reform than we do today, and I mentioned the physicality of that. Punishment for the Georgians and the Victorians was physical.
Inmates were subjected to a litany of back-breaking physical torture. The treadmill, fieldwork, using the crank for turning a weighted box that did literally nothing other than exhaust the prisoner. And of course, there was the ultimate and final form of reform: execution.
This is a hanging prison. They would hang in front of the high front walls every quarter following the sessions of the magistrates coming down.
Hanging was a national pastime, and crowds would flock in the thousands to witness the day's gruesome events. Bodmin has seen crowds of 20 to 30,000 onlookers, anxious to get a peek at a miscreant's final moments. At the time, prisoners were executed with the unpredictable and unscientific short drop, the process of hanging someone with an uncalculated length of rope. And the results were not always as desired.
A short drop doesn't take into consideration how tall you are, how big you are, how thick your neck is. Everyone gets the same length of rope, and it would undoubtedly not be long enough to break your neck.
The Victorians inherited the short drop method from the Georgians, and it did not jive with the Victorian sensibilities at all.
Imagine it for a moment. You've got a crowd of 20,000 drunk people in your county market town, and you don't yet have a standing police force. Who's going to control them? Who's going to tell them to behave? And the authorities do not like this. So in 1868, the Victorians say, enough, no more public executions. And they bring all hangings inside the prisons. And every prison in the country has to build a pit or find a drop away from the public gaze, no press, no public, no family, dignity and respect, say the Victorians in your final hours. Then they introduced a method of execution known as the long drop, a calculated length of rope based on your physicality, designed to break your neck instantly, known as the hangman's fracture, to dislocate your vertebrae. If there's a claim to fame to have, we can own it, because in this country, we were phenomenally good at the long drop. So much so that after the Second World War, it was the Pierpoints who were asked to execute the Nazis after the Nuremberg trials using just that method. And the long drop method was what we used in this country until 1964, when the last 2 men were executed.
No matter how you were executed at Bodmin, whether it be by the long or short drop, the really interesting facet we need to explore is what was done with the bodies.
And this is where history comes up against the paranormal. As a historian, I don't like the truth very much. Only people who win get to write that down. I much prefer a fact. Look at the name of history itself. It rather begs the question of where is her story. However, a fact is, written into law, that if you were executed, your body belonged to the prison, and as such, you were to be buried within the confines of the prison, with your feet facing the prison walls. The question I would always ask when visiting a place like Bodmin Jail is, where are the bodies? And the answer is, they're here.
Bodmin Jail is not a sacred space. It is not hallowed holy ground. It is not a consecrated graveyard. And this is potentially deeply problematic.
And the commonly held belief, for nearly 2,000 years, is that if you wanted to get to heaven, you're going to need a couple of things. And one of those is a body, a whole one, so you can rise on Judgment Day. And the second is you need that body to be in consecrated ground. So when Judgment Day comes, up you rise and off you go and see God.
But if you're buried in prison, what happens to you on Judgment Day? Well, you rise, your feet pointed towards the prison, where you proceed to walk back in. You cannot leave. You are forever doomed to perpetual imprisonment.
That's the spiritual punishment. That's the post-mortem punishment.
The grounds of Bodmin Jail still, to this day, contain the bodies of their executed inmates. And this is not unique. Prisons across the UK still serve as the final unresting place for thousands of souls.
Some of them were buried upright facing the wall. They didn't even lay them to rest. Think of the spiritual message that's inferred by that. And this treatment of bodies after execution was just a continuation of post-mortem punishments. We had used anatomists to cut bodies up. Think of the horror of No Judgment Day with that one if you're in bits in a specimen jar. Or gibbet cages, where you were placed after death to rot in public as a sign of warning. Of course, the physicality is appalling, but the spiritual message is, there's no heaven. You're going nowhere come Judgment Day.
Now at Bodmin, they know where the majority of the bodies are. And it does add an extra air of heaviness to the establishment.
I've been at Bodmin Jail a fair few years now, and I can hand on heart say, despite my previous cynicism, there's something here. What it is and what it wants, not entirely sure, nor am I utterly convinced that I want it to tell me. However, I do now have a healthy respect for this building, and I do walk through it with an open mind. Some of the things that have happened here I can explain, others I cannot. I've seen cups and saucers fly off shelves in the cafe when there's been no one near it. I've been followed through the building with footsteps behind me. Walking through the admin block, I felt little fingers grab my hand and hold on when there was no one there. If anyone's had a child, they'll know exactly what that feels like when they reach up to take your hand, and that is what it felt like. I didn't shake them off, I just walked with them through the building.
However, it's not just Jess who has had experiences inside the jail. There is a laundry list of activity that guests and staff alike have cataloged.
We have had people on paranormal tours here begin to act very unusually, come through them and speak through them. We've do glass and table here. We've had glasses fly off the table and smash. We do Ouija board here. And again, they frequently have those interfering and moving. Down in the courtroom, there's a whole issue with lights. So they don't get turned on at night time, but certain members of the staff will walk through and it'll turn into black ball illuminations. They'll all trigger and fire and spark. They do that with me for no reason. We've had electricians out. There's no reason they need to be doing that, but they just do it. We've had tour guides here who will tell us that if they have a large heritage tour going through, they always count the numbers of people that they have with them when they get to the courtroom to make sure that they haven't got anyone join the tour who isn't meant to be on the tour, and equally they haven't lost anyone as they go through the dark walk. And they will frequently say in the courtroom they have an extra 2 people. The most uncomfortable and unsettling experience I had here was in the basement. And for anyone who knows their rules of horror, they will be rolling their eyes and saying, of course it was. Basements are attics, are places no one should go in a supposedly haunted building. But we used to conduct heritage tours in the basement, and there's a spiral staircase that leads down to it.
As you may expect, Jess was uncomfortable in the basement and did not enjoy going down there, particularly by herself. Before descending into the bowels of the building, she would lean over the banister of the spiral staircase and listen to see if there were members of the public down below.
On one afternoon, I was doing just that. I couldn't see right down into the basement. It's a spiral staircase made of stone. But I heard a man shout, "Get out." And he said it 3 times, very loudly, very clear. He sounded incredibly agitated. He sounded very upset. So, forgetting all my laws of horror, I ran down into the basement. "I'm just coming, sir," I said. The basement is one long corridor with an arched stone ceiling. There are various rooms that lead off from it, which would have once held coal and fuel. Now they are empty and dark, so empty and dark that upon arriving down there and looking around, I realized there was no one in the basement. The voice I had heard belonged to nobody that I could physically see.
Shaken and shocked, Jess darted back up the spiral staircase. She ran into the office and frantically told her colleagues that she had heard a disembodied voice emitting from the basement.
Without telling them what the man had said, they looked at me dead in the eye and said, "Was that Mr. Get Out?" And I said, yes. I was not the only one to have heard him. Even now, when I go into that space, I am wary of that particular gentleman.
Another chilling story from Bodmin Jail comes to us from a true innocent, a child. When Jess's son was little, she used to bring him to the prison after school so he could watch his mom conduct the heritage tours on the CCTV.
And one afternoon I was doing the heritage tour and leading through around 10 or 12 people or so, talking about all the grim and gruesome historical facts of the prison, a standard event. And when I got to the end and went to collect my son, he said to me, "That looked really good, Mummy, but who was the little girl on the tour with you?" And he described her, and he said, "She's been following you the whole way round." And I said to him, "There was no little girl on the tour." And he was adamant that he had seen her following me throughout the heritage tour. CCTV footage did not pick her up. Those heritage tours frequently have occurrences happening on them, particularly the 3:00 tour, where, as we're talking in the naval wing, a pair of legs and feet will appear on the steps as if someone is about to do their warden rounds. Are we perhaps interacting with another time and space? If we listen to our academics, they will tell us that time is not linear, it bends and folds in and around itself. So perhaps the prison captures different times interacting, and what that 3 o'clock heritage tour is seeing is exactly that of a warden about to go about his rounds, which is why his legs frequently appear on the stone stairs.
The Naval Wing is a hotbed of peculiar activity, not limited to the 3 p.m. rounding of the prison warden.
And in that wing, on the ground floor, on one of the dark landings where all the bad boys were, is a cell that no one wants to go in. So much so, and so much trouble has it caused, that we've blocked it up. During the renovation work that went on here, a bunch of builders were in the Naval Wing and claimed they were having some rather inappropriate experiences in that cell of being touched. It transpires that, having heard about this and doing our research, we know that there was a man in that wing who was imprisoned for bullying and picking on other men on board ships. So maybe his anger is still there and directed at workmen coming into the Naval Wing. Certainly women will report standing outside that cell and being shoved forwards as if someone wants them to go away. We also have incidences of young girls frequently passing out in areas of that wing for no reason at all that we can ascertain, but it happens with such frequency that we now have a first aid kit down there in that space just in case it's going to happen. It is a very odd building.
Such an odd building that it caught the attention of the TV show Most Haunted, a British ghost hunting show that first aired in 2002. However, Bodmin Jail was actually the center of some controversy and scandal connected to the show.
And Bodmin Jail was actually the location where Derek Okora was caught out as being a fake medium. They fed him false information about a prison guard who worked here, and he used it on the show. The prison guard's name was actually an anagram of Derek Faker. As a result of that, Derek lost his position on Most Haunted. But that tale is even more interesting because its roots are far, far older and are actually related to the Witchcraft Act.
In the 1600s, the Witchcraft Act plainly stated that if you communed with spirits or devils, you will be sentenced to death and forever labeled a witch.
By the time our Georgian friends come around, they look back on these acts and go, it's hokum, it's popish nonsense. There's no such thing as witches. What there is are people who will sell you false medicine.
The Georgians, therefore, amended the act to state that you cannot make fake or untrue claims, as there is no such thing as witches or magic. The last woman convicted under the Witchcraft Act was a lady by the name of Helen Duncan. She was convicted in the 1940s for creating and faking the astounding phenomenon of ectoplasm.
So embarrassed was the government that they were trying a woman during the Second World War for a witchcraft trial that they changed the name of that act in the 1950s to the False Mediums Act. It is that act that caught Derek Okora out. And it's that act that became the Consumer Act. You can't fake it.
But were there ever any real witches imprisoned in Bodmin?
Witches here in Bodmin. Yes, we've got two brilliant stories spanning the change in the witchcraft trials. The first one is in the mid-1640s, and she was called Anne Jeffreys. She worked locally, looked after children for a rather well-to-do family. One day, she claimed she'd been out in the garden and fairies had taken her. That's what she said. Fairies had taken her. And she went to fairyland, she said, and when she came back, they had given her the gift of clairvoyancy and healing. And she became known as a healing woman locally.
Claiming to have been abducted by fairies and then imbued with magical healing powers was maybe not the wisest of claims to make in the 17th century. Anne was swiftly arrested and taken to the mayor's house in Bodmin. This was the location that served as the jail before the building we see today was erected in 1790. She was thrown in the basement and left to essentially rot. She was locked away without food or water, and it is believed that they tried to walk her as a method to encourage her to confess. The practice of walking is exactly as it sounds. A prisoner is made to walk endlessly, without rest or sustenance.
She claims that her fairies came and fed her, and certainly what happened, rather luckily for Anne, was the English Civil War. Cornwall is a royalist stronghold in the 1640s, and we're getting our butt kicked by the parliamentarians, and they're coming this way. And I should think that the mayor looked at the witch in his basement and went, "I've got better things to do than this." And they should go, very, very lucky. She lived into her 90s, actually, up on the coast near Padstow. So Anne got away with it. There are various interpretations of that story, such as something traumatic happened in the garden and she created a mental state that involved fairies to save herself from having to deal with it. There's no proof. This story is too old, but we know she was real and that she was here.
The second witch held in Bodmin was not quite so lucky, but does remain far more well known. She was a lady by the name of Joan White.
She was known as the fighting fairy woman of Bodmin. Fighting because she allegedly had a very foul temper and wasn't dissuaded from using her fists when cross. Fairy woman because she was quite short in stature, and she practiced her craft, her healing at Scarlet's Well here in Bodmin. And she was imprisoned in Bodmin Jail in 1813, not for being a witch, because of course the Witchcraft Act was changed by that point, but she's in here for public fighting, for being a ne'er-do-well. She dies in the prison, probably of pneumonia, one would imagine, and that's where the story gets a bit weird, because it is said that she was anatomized, so the surgeons dissected her, and then it's said that her bones are kept at the jail. Now, whether that's true or not, I think it actually doesn't matter, because it's the stories now that begin to kick in, and it means we can keep talking about them. So her bones were allegedly kept at the jail, and in the later part of the 1800s, used in a seance on site, which apparently went so horrendously wrong that the bones were locked away and lost, only to turn up in the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle, where they were displayed for many years in a glass coffin. I can only think of a screwed up Snow White at this point. And I can remember visiting it as a small child, and you would go into the museum and there was Joan's bones in her glass coffin. The last witch of Cornwall, said the label on the box.
However, after a long tenure on display at the museum and a string of unexplainable paranormal activity, the new curator decided that they were deeply uncomfortable with the exploitation of Joan and her bones.
So they arranged for Joan's bones to be buried outside the church wall of a wonderful church just above Boscastle called Minster Church. And you can go up there today, walk up through the woods to Minster Church, and just outside the graveyard walls on the edge of the woodland is a gravestone that says Joan White, died Bodmin Jail, 1813, no longer abused. And there's always offerings there. People leave her all kinds of things, mainly sugar, because she had quite a sweet tooth, apparently. I tend to go once a year and just say, "Thanks for the story, Joan," and leave her a tot of grog and a brownie of some kind, and normally some rolling tobacco, because I think she was the kind of lass that would have quite liked those sorts of things.
Joan's body isn't actually under that little gravestone. There was fear that she would be dug up and her bones would be scattered across the black market of witches' relics. So she's actually buried in an unmarked grave in the woods, finally at peace. Bodmin Jail is a deeply sorrowful location. It encapsulates the evil that humans are capable of doing to one another. But it also highlights the changes and the evolution of time and how we can grow and still honor and respect, and most importantly, learn from our past.
But what we do see here at Bodmin Jail is that the history is brilliant. And if we don't look at history, if we don't stare it in the eye, if we don't face up to it, if we shove it to the bottom of a river or knock it in a hole or put a cloth over it and pretend it was never there, then we'll never learn. We'll never change. And next time, we'll never do better.
Jess and her team are passionate about their role as custodians of the jail. Their job is to share and preserve not only the building, but also the history and the spirits who still remain on site. And I think it is beautifully summarized in their motto: explore the mystery, respect the history. The jail is open for both historical tours during the day and a whole host of haunted walks, tours, and investigations in the evening. This is a location that must be seen to be believed. Head on over to www.bodminjail.org and plan your own visit to this incredible location. Do you have a spooky story you'd like to share? I'd love to hear it. Drop me an email at thewestlondonwitch@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Facebook at The West London Witch. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. And come and follow us for additional content on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again. The West London Witch is created by me, Rebecca Strazina. Our sound designer and production magician is the incredible Danny Cross. Our theme music was bespokely written and performed by the wickedly talented Kyle Hall. Our cover art is the beautiful collaboration between Lizzie Wilson and Jake Bowser. Special thanks to Miss Sinead Bowers, our quality control and biggest cheerleader. And thank you to you, all of our listeners all over the world. These are your stories. Thank you for sharing them with us.